My grandmother's letter concluded, "Clara, I am telling you this not to tarnish our family name, but to free you. We Ashford women have a habit of building beautiful cages for ourselves. We marry the wrong men. We take the safe jobs. We tend to the reputations of the family while our own souls wither inside us." I almost did the same. It was finding this story, Clara's story, that gave me the courage to leave my own cold marriage, to buy this house not as a wife, but as a businesswoman, and to build a life on my own terms. This house is not a punishment. It is a mirror. Fixing the house is the task, but the challenge is to fix yourself. Find your passion. Don't be afraid of a life that looks messy to others. Don't let the fear of scandal stop you from painting your own walls with the colors of the life you truly want. The last part of this story, and the final piece of the puzzle, is in the garden by the old oak. Dig where the roots point north. With all my love and hope, grandmother. I sat in the turret room as the sun traced a slow path across the dusty floor. The old letters of a long-dead artist spread across my lap like fallen leaves. I read every single one, my eyes devouring the faded script. His words were full of light and color, of a passion so vivid it seemed to shimmer on the page, alive even after all these decades. He wrote about the exact shade of gold the light turned when it fell through her hair, about the way her laughter sounded like wind chimes in the garden, about the agony of watching her leave the theater after their stolen meetings and knowing she was returning to a life that didn't include him. Her return letters, which my grandmother had preserved in the same hidden drawer, were more carefully worded but trembled with a desperate, hidden love, a woman trying so hard to be proper while her heart screamed for something wild and free. I wept for them. I wept for the woman in the portrait, trapped in a beautiful house with a heart full of ghosts, condemned to perform the role of a dutiful wife for 40 years while her soul resided in a secret room upstairs. And I wept for my grandmother, who had understood her, and for myself, who was only just beginning to. I had been so proud of my safe, orderly life, my quiet apartment, my predictable job, my carefully managed emotions. But what was it all but a smaller, more modern cage? I had been so afraid of making a mistake that I had made no choices at all. I went outside as dusk began to creep across the overgrown garden, painting the sky in shades of lavender and rose. The old oak tree was immense, its trunk a monument to endurance, its roots snaking across the lawn like the slow, patient fingers of time, cracking the old flagstone path and buckling the ground. One massive root angled sharply away from the trunk, pointing like an arrow toward a thicket of wild roses that had grown into an impenetrable tangle of thorns and pale pink blossoms. I found a rusty spade in a dilapidated garden shed, its handle rough with splinters, and with a feeling of surreal inevitability, as if I were acting out a script written long before my birth, I began to dig. The earth was soft and dark, rich with decades of fallen leaves, giving way easily as if it had been waiting to yield its secret. I didn't have to dig deep. About a foot down, the spade struck something solid with a dull, metallic thud. Not stone, metal. I dropped to my knees and cleared the dirt away with my bare hands, the soil caking under my fingernails, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I pulled out a small, rusted tin box, the kind used for tea or biscuits a century ago. Its once bright pattern faded to a ghost of what it had been. The lid was stubborn, rusted shut, but it eventually gave way with a protesting groan. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet that had long since decomposed to a dark, fibrous dust, was a man's pocket watch, its silver case tarnished but still beautiful, its craftsmanship evident in every delicate curve. I picked it up with trembling fingers, and the back of the case fell open, the tiny hinge having given way decades ago. Inside wasn't the intricate machinery of a timepiece, but a miniature portrait, perfectly preserved by some miracle of the sealed case, of a young man with laughing eyes and paint-stained fingers. Thomas, the artist who had loved my great-grandmother with a passion that defied a century of silence. On the back of the miniature was an inscription in tiny, delicate script, the letters so small I had to hold it close to my face to read them. My time is forever yours. Eternally T. Beneath the watch, there was a woman's silk ribbon, the color of faded, ghostly lavender, and a single, pressed, crimson rose, so fragile it looked like it would crumble at a touch. The last artifacts of a love that a century of silence could not extinguish. I didn't cry this time. A strange, deep peace settled over me, a quiet stillness that seemed to emanate from the objects in my hands. I had been entrusted with their secret. I was the guardian of their love story. It wasn't a scandal to be hidden. It was a sacred trust, a flame passed down through 3 generations of Ashford women, and it was now burning in my hands. The year that followed was the hardest and most transformative of my life. The restoration of Blackthorn House became my obsession, my religion, the axis around which my entire world turned. I hired a local crew, a father named Ben and his 2 sons, who knew old houses like surgeons knew bodies, who could look at a cracked beam or a sagging floor and diagnose the problem with a single, knowing glance. I learned the difference between a dovetail joint and a mortise and tenon, learned to identify the various eras of hardware by the shape of a screw head, learned how to strip a century of paint to find the golden oak beneath, its grain still beautiful after all those years of darkness. I was covered in dust and sweat and shellac for months, my hair perpetually tied back in a kerchief, my hands developing calluses I was irrationally proud of. I fell into bed every night physically exhausted but mentally exhilarated, my mind buzzing with plans for the next day, the next room, the next discovery. The house was coming alive beneath my hands, its colors emerging from the gloom like a photograph developing in a darkroom, and so was I. The secret room became my office, my sanctuary, my command center. I cleaned the windows until the light poured in like liquid gold, illuminating every corner of the octagonal space. I framed Alara's portrait and hung it on the wall above the fireplace, her secretive smile now watching over my work. The letters from Thomas I had carefully archived in acid-free folders, a historian's tribute to an artist's undying love. As the house healed, I found myself healing too. The quiet, timid Clara who had walked into Mr. Henderson's office, the woman who had built her entire life around avoiding risk and minimizing exposure, was slowly being replaced by someone else. A Clara who could negotiate with stubborn suppliers and win, who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty, who could laugh with her crew over coffee and donuts at sunrise while they teased her about her latest misadventure with a paint sprayer. I even started to paint, a hobby I had abandoned in college because my professor had told me I wasn't good enough, that I lacked the raw talent necessary to be a real artist. I set up an easel in Alara's turret room, right by the windows where the light was best, and began to paint the garden, the house, the way the light shifted through the oak tree at different hours of the day. My paintings weren't masterpieces, they were clumsy and imperfect and full of mistakes, but they were alive. They were mine. And every time I picked up a brush, I felt a connection to Alara, to Thomas, to my grandmother, to the long line of creators who had stood in this room and poured their souls onto canvas. It wasn't just the house and myself that changed. The discovery of the love letters had a profound, unexpected effect on Kate, a ripple that spread outward in ways I never could have predicted. She had been so shattered by the reading of the will, feeling rejected and worthless and publicly humiliated by a woman she had always believed didn't understand her. I invited her to the house one rainy afternoon, and in the turret room, with the rain drumming softly against the newly restored windows, I told her the story of Alara and Thomas. I showed her the letters, the miniature portrait, the pressed rose. She read them with tears streaming down her face, her mascara leaving dark tracks on her cheeks. For Kate, the story wasn't about betrayal. It was about a woman trapped by circumstance, a feeling she understood with painful, visceral intimacy. She had been trapped by her own poor choices, her dependency on a man who didn't love her, her weak spine, as grandmother had so bluntly put it. She had been living in a cage of her own making, and she had convinced herself the door was locked from the outside. Alara's story was a lifeline thrown across a century. It gave her the courage to see her own situation with new eyes, not as a permanent sentence, but as a cage she could unlock if she was brave enough to try. 2 weeks after that rainy afternoon, she left her toxic boyfriend. She packed her things while he was at work and moved into Blackthorn House with me, taking over one of the half-restored guest rooms. She started a small online business selling vintage clothing, using our grandmother's collection of fabrics and accessories as her initial stock, items she had initially dismissed as worthless old junk. The first edition novels, the gift she had initially scorned as a cruel joke, became the aesthetic heart of her brand. She photographed them alongside the vintage clothing, creating a look that was literary, romantic, and utterly unique. She began to find the steel in her own spine, and our relationship, which had been distant and strained for years, grew into a deep and powerful friendship that surprised us both. We became partners in the restoration of the house, and in the restoration of ourselves. Marcus was a different story. He remained furious, his rage calcifying into a bitter, permanent resentment. He sued to contest the will, a long, messy legal battle that drained his finances and embittered him further, consuming his savings and his relationships in equal measure. He refused to ever set foot in Blackthorn House, calling it a money pit full of dead secrets, and accusing me of manipulating our grandmother in her final days. The fight eventually died in court, the judge finding the second will perfectly valid after a review of the evidence. But the chasm between him and the rest of the family remained, a sad, cold monument to his own greed. The 1967 Mustang, a car he had coveted for years and talked about constantly, sat undriven in his garage under a layer of dust, the one gift from his grandmother he couldn't bear to even look at. It was the only victory she had over him, and it was a hollow one. The final piece of the mystery clicked into place on a crisp autumn afternoon, just weeks before my year was up. The leaves on the old oak tree had turned to brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and the air had that sharp, clean smell that signals the end of one season and the beginning of another. I was in the cellar, supervising the installation of a new furnace, when Ben, the older man who had become something of a mentor to me, called me over. He was pointing at a section of the stone foundation wall, holding up a lantern so I could see. "Look at this, Clara," he said, his voice filled with the quiet excitement of a craftsman who has spotted something unusual. "This stonework here is different. Not part of the original build. It's much newer, maybe 1960s. See how the mortar doesn't quite match?" He tapped it with a hammer, and it made a hollow sound, a resonant, empty thud that was completely different from the solid, dense sound of the surrounding foundation. "There's a cavity behind it. Something's been walled up here, and not that long ago, relatively speaking." We carefully removed the loose stones, working them free one by one with a crowbar and a great deal of patience. The mortar crumbled easily, confirming Ben's suspicion that this was a much newer addition to the original 19th century foundation. Behind the stones was a small, dry alcove, a deliberate space that had been carved out and then sealed with purpose. And inside the alcove, resting on a piece of slate to keep it off the damp ground, was a metal strongbox, much more modern and secure than the biscuit tin I had dug up by the oak tree. It was a fireproof document safe, the kind you could buy at any office supply store, its gray surface unremarkable except for the combination lock on the front. My heart was racing as I pulled it out, the weight substantial in my hands. My grandmother's birth date didn't work. Neither did Heiress. The date of my grandmother's marriage, the date she bought the house, the date of my own birth. I tried them all, and the lock remained stubbornly sealed. Then, on a hunch, a whisper of intuition that seemed to come from somewhere outside myself, I tried the date from the last love letter Thomas had ever written to Clara. The day before he died. The day their story had ended. The lock clicked open with a smooth, well-oiled precision that suggested my grandmother had maintained it until the very end. Inside, I didn't find love letters. I found a stack of documents, crisp and official, and a final letter from my grandmother. The documents were stock certificates, decades-old investments in a small, local tech company that my grandmother had seeded with a tiny amount of money in the early 1980s, a company that had, over 40 years, quietly and spectacularly grown into a global giant whose products were in every home in the country. The shares had been automatically reinvesting their dividends the entire time, compounding and growing like the oak tree outside, silent and unstoppable. The total value was staggering, more than the entire rest of her estate combined, more than Marcus's lost inheritance, more than the value of the house and the land and everything else she had ever owned. This was the true source of this separate account for the restoration. And the remaining funds that would become mine if I finished the year. It was a fortune beyond anything I had ever imagined. Her final letter was brief, written in a hand that was shakier than the others, the letters sloping more dramatically, but still undeniably hers. Clara, if you have found this, you have not only restored the house, but you have, as I suspected, dug into every corner of its soul. You have followed the clues from the attic to the garden to the cellar, and you have proven yourself worthy of this final secret. This money is not a reward for swinging a hammer, it is a seed. Money is a tool, nothing more and nothing less. Clara was a prisoner of her husband's fortune, trapped by the very wealth that was supposed to bring her freedom. I used my fortune to build an empire, but that empire was never the point. The point was the building itself, the act of creation. Use this to build something good. Create, protect, grow. This is the final test. Don't let the money become your cage, as it so easily can. Use it as your paint. With all my love and pride, grandmother. I sat on the cold cellar floor, the strongbox in my lap and the letter in my hands, and I laughed until I cried. Great, heaving sobs of relief and wonder and overwhelming gratitude. It wasn't just a house. It had never been just a house. It was a scavenger hunt that spanned generations, a masterclass in life taught by a ghost who had loved me enough to challenge me rather than coddle me. She hadn't just left me a building. She had left me a mission, a story, a purpose, and the means to write my own next chapter. Every piece of the puzzle had been placed with deliberate care. Every clue had been designed to teach me something, to push me further, to force me to become the woman she had always known I could be. The day the one-year term ended was bright and cold, a perfect, crystalline winter morning with a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The house behind me was transformed, its gray, peeling paint replaced with a historically accurate cream and burgundy, its gingerbread trim restored to its original intricate glory, its windows gleaming in the winter sunlight. The wraparound porch had been rebuilt, the sagging steps replaced, the roof patched and sealed. Smoke curled from the chimney, the first fire in the restored parlor fireplace crackling cheerfully inside. Mr. Henderson came to the house, a ritual as formal as a knighting, and he stood in the foyer with his ancient briefcase and his ancient spectacles and looked around with something that might have been wonder. We sat in the now gleaming parlor, the light pouring in through the restored stained glass windows, casting rainbows on the polished wood floor that Ben and his sons had spent weeks bringing back to life. He handed me a single piece of paper, thick and official, embossed with the county seal. The deed to Blackthorn House, officially and forever in my name, along with a cashier's check for the remainder of the restoration funds, a number that still made my head spin every time I looked at it. It has been a genuine pleasure, Miss Ashford, Mr. Henderson said, a rare smile cracking his ancient face, revealing teeth that were surprisingly straight for a man his age. Your grandmother would have been extraordinarily proud. I have handled many estates in my 50 years of practice, but I have never seen a bequest fulfilled with such dedication and such heart. After he left, I didn't feel the urge to celebrate with champagne or call a real estate agent. I didn't want to share the moment with anyone, not yet. I walked through the house alone, my hand trailing along the smooth, newly finished banister, feeling the warmth of the wood beneath my palm. I went from room to room, remembering the way each one had looked when I first walked through that creaking front door, the dust and the cobwebs and the despairing neglect. And now, each room glowed. The library shelves had been oiled and restocked, the books aired and cleaned. The dining room chandelier had been painstakingly restored, its crystals catching the light and scattering it like diamonds. The kitchen had been updated with modern appliances hidden behind custom cabinetry, that matched the original Victorian aesthetic. The house was alive again, breathing and warm and full of light. I went to the turret room last, as I always did. It was still my sanctuary, the heart of the house, just as my grandmother had promised. I stood before Alara's portrait, the woman in the frame looking back at me with her secretive smile. I had learned so much about her over the past year, had read every letter, had traced the faint pencil sketches in the margins of Thomas's correspondence, had found a diary of hers hidden behind a loose board in the turret room floor that detailed the small, daily acts of resistance that had kept her sane during her long, gilded imprisonment. The woman in the picture looked back at me, and her smile seemed, at last, one of approval. I had taken her story, her pain and her passion, and let it change me. I hadn't built a cage for myself. I had restored a sanctuary for her memory and for my own future. I hadn't looked for a Thomas of my own, a love to define me, because I had fallen in love, completely and deeply, with the life I was building, with the strong, capable, and creative woman I had become over the course of this impossible year. Kate found me there an hour later, coming up the stairs with 2 mugs of tea and a smile that was no longer brittle and desperate, but genuine and warm. She had changed too, had shed her old skin like the house had shed its layers of peeling paint. Her online business was thriving, her designs had been featured in 2 different magazines, and she had just signed a lease on a small storefront in town. She was dating a carpenter she'd met through Ben, a quiet, kind man who looked at her like she was the most fascinating person in the world. We sat together in the turret room, drinking our tea and looking out at the winter garden, the bare branches of the oak tree etched against the cold blue sky. "What do you think grandmother would say if she could see us now?" Kate asked, her voice soft and reflective. I thought about it for a moment, looking at the portrait above the fireplace. "I think she'd say that it took us long enough," I said, and Kate laughed, a real laugh, full and unself-conscious. "And then she'd probably tell us to stop sitting around and get back to work." The story had a perfect, quiet symmetry, the kind of closure that felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. My grandmother's challenge had been a mirror, reflecting the cages we Ashford women so meticulously built for ourselves, generation after generation. She had shattered mine with a sledgehammer disguised as a Victorian mansion. She had used a crumbling house and a century-old secret to show me that safety was not a synonym for living, and that a love, even a lost and tragic one, was worth more than a lifetime of comfortable emptiness. My inheritance wasn't bricks and mortar, though the house was beautiful beyond measure. It wasn't even the staggering sum of money in the strongbox, though that was life-changing by any practical measure. It was the courage of Clara, a woman who had dared to love in a time when love could destroy her. It was the wisdom of Eleanor, a woman who had taken that story and used it to build an empire and, ultimately, to save her granddaughters. And it was the improbable, unshakable, and deeply personal journey to find my own truest self, the Clara who existed beneath the fear and the caution and the desperate need for safety. I wasn't a ghost in a gilded cage anymore. I was the painter of my own life, and the masterpiece was just beginning. Blackthorn House stood restored, its windows gleaming, its rooms full of light and laughter. Kate was building her business and her new relationship, finding strength she had never known she possessed. The story of Clara and Thomas, a love that had been hidden in shame for a century, was now honored and treasured. The letters and the pocket watch and the pressed rose displayed in a shadow box in the turret room, a memorial to the courage of loving fiercely in a world that demanded restraint. And I, Clara Ashford, the quiet one, the careful one, had become something new entirely. I was a restorer of houses and a keeper of stories. I was a painter, a businesswoman, a sister, a guardian of legacies. I was, finally and completely, exactly who my grandmother had always known I could be.